In this demonstration, we're going to use SpectraCX, the complete round-trip SCA engineering modeling tool, to build an SCA waveform model. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a package to store all of my SCX components. Now that I have a package, I can start to populate my package with the components I need for my waveform. The first one I'm going to create is my LAC SCA resource. That creates a LAC package, and SCX starts to populate with the minimum components and make basic associations. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add required dependencies so that I can build code for my model later on. I need to tell SpectraCX that I'm going to be building code for the Linux x86 environment. I need to make the associations with the input component of the model, and also I need to make association to the x86 processor component. Now that I have my basic model of my resource, let me just demonstrate to you the powerful feature of SCA validation. And SpectraCX can validate that model against the SCA, and we can see at this point that the validation has been complete. We have 0 errors and 0 warnings. The next thing I need to do to my model is I need to add user-defined ports, my user ports, to my LAC interface. I go across here to the palette, and I simply select the port component and drag and drop it onto the LAC interface. And I'm going to get SpectraCX to search for the high-speed data user interface which I've defined, and to use that user interface. I can go across to the Properties tab here now and change the default name to something more meaningful in my model, and I'm going to call it the upper layer data import. I then added the remaining user ports to my LAC resource. So the next stage is now to populate my model with all the remaining components that I need. So I'm going to create the rest of my SCA resource components. So I need a Mac, I need a PHY, I need an SCA resource controller, and an upper layers SCA resource. I then completed each resource by adding dependencies and user-defined ports. Now, so that I can have my SCA resource controller control the resources in the waveform, I'm going to add some control ports. But to do that, I actually use the resource interface, the core framework resource interface. So let me do that. In fact, I use the resource inverse interface for my control ports, and I'm going to have one of these for each of my components in my model. I add the port onto my model, onto my interface component, and in this case I set the kind not to data. We have a pull down list of selectable values, and we choose the control type, and we do that for each of the other 3 ports, control ports, that I'll add to my SCA resource. I then completed all of my resources, ensuring they had all the ports they required and all the settings. I'm going to now add a CX component diagram to create my application, and I'm going to call that my production waveform diagram. And I simply go across the SCA application drawer, I select the application component, and I drop it onto my diagram, and I give it the name of production waveform. I'm going to need quite a bit of space to build my waveform, so I'll just zoom out a few times, and then I can make the application quite large so I can drag and drop components on my application. Then simply what I do is I go across to where my components are, and I select each of the components that I need, and I drag and drop an instance of each one of those components onto the palette, onto the drawing, and finally the SCA resource, and I'll put that over this side over here. Okay, now that I've populated my application with my components, it's now time to connect those ports together. So I do that by selecting the connector and dragging and dropping between the required ports. And we can see that when we make a successful connection of ports of the right type, we have this connector icon appearing on the line. So I do that for all of my data ports between each of my SCA resources, and I also do that to connect my control ports for my SCA resource controller, which I connect from the port, and then I drag and drop that onto the resource component itself, and that creates a control connection from my SCA resource controller to each of my resources. Okay, now that we've wired our application together, let's just perform a SCA validation to check to make sure we're still compliant. SpectraCX does that validation. It indicates to us that we still have a problem, and that's that we don't have an assembly controller assigned to our waveform assembly. And that's simply a matter by selecting the application. So to solve that problem, we select the application, go down to the Properties window and the SCA tab. We'll notice here that in the controller field there's nothing, and we can then search for our SCA assembly controller, and we can see we have the assembly controller here that we've created for our production waveform package. We'll select that, and then inserts that into the controller field, and we can do another SCA validation, and we now see that we've corrected that problem and we have no more errors. And that completes our demonstration of using SpectraCX to build an SCA waveform model.